There was a moment, somewhere in the middle of a sold-out lecture hall, when Jordan Peterson stood at a podium in front of 3,000 people and felt completely, utterly alone. The applause was deafening. The book had sold millions of copies. His name was on the cover of magazines across the Western world. And yet something was already beginning to crack beneath the surface. Something the cameras couldn't catch, something the headlines would miss for years. How does a man who built an entire philosophy around suffering and meaning find himself undone by the very things he warned the rest of the world about? How does someone who told millions of people to stand up straight and face the darkness end up bedridden, dependent, and fighting for his own life in a foreign hospital? And why, at 63, does Jordan Peterson look like a man who has walked through fire, not once but 4 times, and is only now beginning to understand what the fire was actually trying to burn away? To understand where Jordan Peterson stands today, you have to go back to the very beginning. Not to the bestseller lists or the viral YouTube clips. Not to the Senate hearings or the culture war headlines. You have to go back to a small, cold town in northern Alberta, Canada, a place called Fairview, where the winters are not poetic. They are brutal, honest, and unforgiving, the kind of cold that makes you understand, before you're old enough to understand anything, that the world is not designed for your comfort. Jordan Burnt Peterson was born on June 12, 1962, in Edmonton, Alberta, but it was Fairview that shaped him. His father, Walter, was a schoolteacher. His mother, Beverly, was a librarian. They were not wealthy people, but they were serious ones. Books were everywhere in that house. Ideas were treated with a kind of quiet reverence. Jordan grew up in a home where thinking was not just encouraged, it was expected. He was a strange, intense child. Not strange in a way that made him popular. Strange in the way that made other children wary and adults simultaneously impressed and unsettled. He read voraciously, obsessively, the way some kids play sports or collect baseball cards. He consumed books on religion, philosophy, psychology, mythology, anything that tried to answer the questions he couldn't stop asking. Why do people do evil things? Why does suffering exist? Is there a way to live that actually means something? The landscape of northern Alberta became, for Peterson, a kind of philosophical backdrop. The vast emptiness of the Canadian North, the flat horizon, the enormous sky, the sense that you were one small creature in an indifferent universe, pressed against him constantly. It didn't break him. It focused him. He would later say that he grew up with a deep, almost physical awareness of chaos and order, of the thin line between a life that works and a life that collapses. You could see in the town around him men who drank too much, families that dissolved quietly over a single bad winter. The machinery of ordinary human failure, operating in slow motion all around a boy who was paying very close attention. He wasn't an easy teenager. He was argumentative, opinionated, and deeply certain that most people, including adults, were not thinking clearly about the things that mattered most. He ran for local office as a teenager, not out of ambition exactly, but out of a genuine belief that the people currently making decisions were getting things catastrophically wrong. He lost. He was embarrassed. And that embarrassment became something useful, a lesson about the difference between being right and being able to persuade. It was a lesson he would return to again and again for the rest of his life. But there was a wound that cut deeper than any political defeat. When Peterson was young, and this is something he has spoken about with careful, measured pain, he watched the slow disintegration of people he loved. Not in a single dramatic moment, in the quiet, grinding way that suffering actually works. He watched a close childhood friend named Chris descend into a kind of darkness that Peterson, even with all his reading and thinking, couldn't fully explain or prevent. Chris was brilliant, funny, the kind of person who lit up a room in Fairview the way that rooms in Fairview don't usually get lit up. And then, gradually, something went wrong. The drinking started. The decisions got worse. The trajectory bent downward at an angle that, once established, seemed almost impossible to correct. Peterson watched this happen with the helpless, horrified attention of someone who understood, intellectually, exactly what was occurring, but could do nothing to stop it. This experience, watching someone with genuine potential destroy themselves through a combination of chaos, bad choices, and what Peterson would later identify as a refusal to take on the burden of their own existence, became the seed of everything that followed. It became the emotional core of his clinical practice, his teaching, his writing. The question was no longer abstract. It was personal. It was crisp. It was the look on a face when someone realizes, too late, that they have not been careful enough with their own life. Peterson carried that look with him into every lecture hall, every therapy session, every page he ever wrote. The rules he eventually gave the world were not invented from theory. They were excavated from grief. He left Fairview and eventually found his way to the University of Alberta, where he studied political science before pivoting to psychology. He was drawn to the darkest questions the discipline had to offer, not the comfortable, adjustment-focused psychology of self-esteem and positive reinforcement. He was drawn toward Carl Jung, toward Alexander Solzhenitsyn, toward Fyodor Dostoevsky, thinkers who had looked directly at the worst things human beings were capable of and had not flinched. He wrote his undergraduate thesis on the political belief systems of alcoholics. Even then, even as a young student, the theme was the same. Why do people choose destruction? Why do they lie to themselves? What is the cost of that lie? He moved to McGill University in Montreal for graduate studies in clinical psychology, and it was there that the intellectual foundation of his life's work was truly poured. He was obsessed with the Holocaust, not in a morbid way, in a philosophical, almost desperate way. He needed to understand how ordinary people had participated in monstrous things. He needed to understand the architecture of self-deception that made it possible for a person to tell themselves they were good while doing evil. He read everything. He watched the footage. He sat with the horror until it became something other than horror, until it became a map of the human psyche at its most dangerous. Those studies cost him something. He has described the period as one of the most disturbing of his life, a time when he had nightmares regularly, when the material he was consuming began to press against the edges of his own psychological stability. But he went through it anyway, because the alternative was to look away. And Jordan Peterson has never been able to look away, that he completed his PhD and took a position at Harvard University as an assistant professor. Harvard. This is the detail that often gets glossed over in the culture war version of his story. Before the controversy, before the politics, before the podcasts, Jordan Peterson was a Harvard-trained researcher whose work on personality, aggression, and meaning was taken seriously by some of the most rigorous academic minds in the world. He published research. He built a reputation. He was, by every conventional measure, succeeding. But something about that success felt thin to him. Incomplete. He was speaking to other academics, writing for journals that most people would never read, and the questions that burned inside him, the ones about how a person actually builds a life worth living, were reaching almost no one outside the academy that he returned to Canada. He took a position at the University of Toronto. He built his clinical practice. He taught. He wrote the beginnings of what would become his first book. And for years, he existed in that particular kind of obscurity that belongs to people who are doing genuinely important work that the world hasn't found yet. He was not unhappy, but he was not yet fully alive in the way he would later become. Something was still waiting. And then, in the autumn of 2016, something happened that would change everything. Not in a way that Peterson had planned or even wanted. The Canadian government introduced Bill C-16, legislation that, among other things, dealt with compelled speech around gender pronouns. Peterson, already deeply suspicious of what he saw as ideologically motivated distortions of psychological and biological reality, posted a video to YouTube. Just a professor talking to a camera in an office. No production team, no marketing, no strategy. Just a man saying what he actually believed in plain language because he believed that saying it was necessary regardless of the consequences. The consequences were immediate and severe. He was called before his university. His colleagues turned against him. Protesters gathered outside his lectures. He received death threats. His face appeared on national television and then international television, usually framed as a monster, a bigot, a dangerous reactionary. The university threatened his livelihood. He could have backed down. He could have softened his language, offered the required apologies, and returned quietly to the obscurity that had previously been his home. He didn't. He stood at a microphone on the steps of a building at the University of Toronto and said, clearly, that he would not comply with compelled speech under any circumstances. The cold northern Alberta boy who had watched people destroy themselves through cowardice and self-deception was not going to destroy himself the same way, and the world noticed. His YouTube lectures, already quietly accumulating millions of views from people who had stumbled upon his talks on Jungian psychology and the meaning of myth, exploded overnight. Letters began arriving from all over the world. Young men, primarily, writing to say that his ideas had saved their lives, that they had been drifting, without purpose, without direction, without any framework for understanding why their suffering mattered, and that Peterson's voice had reached them in that darkness like something they hadn't known they were waiting for. The lectures on the psychological significance of biblical stories, the discussions of Dostoevsky, the simple, blunt instruction to clean your room, to tell the truth, to take responsibility for yourself before you try to change the world. It resonated with a ferocity that surprised even Peterson himself. 12 Rules for Life. An Antidote to Chaos was published in January 2018. It sold 3 million copies in the first year, then 5 million, then 10 million. He went on a world tour. He spoke to sold-out halls in London, Sydney, Amsterdam, New York. He appeared on every major platform. He debated, interviewed, argued, and preached in the most secular, intellectual sense of that word, to audiences that kept growing regardless of how ferociously his critics attacked him. And the attacks were ferocious. He was called a gateway to fascism, a pseudo-intellectuel, a dangerous right-wing ideologue. He was compared to figures whose names he refused to share a sentence with. The more they attacked, the more his followers grew. The more his followers grew, the more they attacked. But here's the thing that the culture war version of the story misses completely. Behind all of that, behind the tours and the book sales and the podcast appearances and the viral clips, Jordan Peterson was beginning to crack. His wife, Tammy, who had been his partner for more than 3 decades, the woman he had met as a teenager in Fairview and married and built an entire life with, was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of kidney cancer in 2019. This was not a public relations problem. This was not content. This was his wife, the woman who had, by his own account, kept him tethered to the earth during his darkest years. The woman who laughed at his jokes even when no one else understood them. The woman whose handwriting was probably on 1,000 notes he had kept in filing cabinets because he could not bear to throw them away. She was sick, and the prognosis was terrifying, and Jordan Peterson, the man who had told millions of people how to face suffering with dignity, found himself completely unprepared for the weight of this specific suffering in an attempt to manage his anxiety and the physical symptoms he had been struggling with for years. Peterson had been prescribed benzodiazepines. This is a legal medication, a common one, prescribed by real doctors to real patients in real pain. But benzodiazepines, in Peterson's case, produced a dependency that he did not fully recognize until it was already entrenched. And when his wife's illness accelerated his anxiety to a new and unbearable level, the medication that was supposed to help became its own catastrophe. He tried to stop. The withdrawal was not manageable at home. In early 2020, at the height of the global pandemic, when hospitals in North America were already strained beyond capacity and normal treatment protocols were suspended, Peterson found himself in a condition that could not be treated in Canada. He was transported by his family in a state of crisis to Russia, of all places, where doctors were reportedly willing to perform an aggressive medical detox that was not available or approved in North America. The procedure was brutal. He was in a medically induced coma for 8 days. He developed pneumonia. He could not walk. He could barely speak. This was not the fall of a public figure. This was a man almost dying. He came back, but slowly. The recovery was not triumphant. It was painful, humiliating, and disorienting in ways that he has described with a rawness that is difficult to read. He had lost physical capabilities. His memory was fragmented. The voice that had filled those sold-out halls was hoarse and uncertain. There were months when he could not work, when simply existing from morning to evening required more effort than he had ever given anything in his life. His daughter, Michaela, who had her own history of serious medical struggles, was instrumental in his care during this period, a reversal of parental roles that Peterson has reflected on with evident emotion. He returned to the internet gradually, and the return was not met with universal sympathy. Some of his critics saw the addiction story as evidence of hypocrisy. A man who counseled strength and personal responsibility had been felled by prescription drug dependency. The commentary was often cruel in the particular way that internet commentary about fallen figures tends to be cruel. Not because the critics were entirely wrong, but because they were watching a human being suffer and calling it a punchline. Peterson responded to this, when he was able to respond at all, not with anger, but with something more complicated. He said the experience had humbled him in ways that decades of clinical psychology had not. He said he had finally understood, in his body and not just his mind, what it meant to be a patient rather than a clinician. The recovery from the benzodiazepine crisis overlapped with his wife's ongoing battle with cancer. Tammy Peterson survived, a fact that Peterson has described as nothing short of miraculous, given the severity of her diagnosis. She underwent multiple surgeries. She fought, in her own quiet and determined way, the way that people who have been loved well often find the strength to fight. And Jordan Peterson, recovering himself, found in her survival something that his entire intellectual and philosophical life had been circling around without quite reaching. He found evidence, personal and undeniable, that suffering can end, that the darkness is real but not permanent, that the person beside you in the cold can sometimes, somehow, still be standing when the cold lifts, that he returned to public life with a different quality of presence. Not softer exactly, but more weathered, more considered. The sharpness was still there, the precise clinical thinking, the willingness to say uncomfortable things in rooms full of people who didn't want to hear them. But there was something new underneath it, a gravity that came not from reading about suffering, but from having lived inside it. He launched a new book, Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life, in March 2021, while he was still in the middle of his recovery. It was, in some ways, the more honest book, less declarative than its predecessor, more willing to sit with complexity, more openly uncertain about things that the first book had approached with a professor's confidence. He began hosting a podcast. He continued touring when his health allowed. He returned to the daily act of putting ideas into the world with what looked, from the outside, like restored energy. But those who paid close attention could see that he had changed. The certainty that had made his early videos so galvanizing had been tempered by experience. He spoke more often about beauty, about gratitude, about the things that had been given to him rather than the things he had earned. He spoke about faith, not in the comfortable, organized religion sense, but in the older, harder sense of faith as a commitment to acting as though meaning exists even when your own life has shown you every reason to believe otherwise. He has spoken, in various interviews and on his podcast, about his relationship with Christianity, not as a formal declaration of conversion, but as a deepening engagement with the stories and the structure of Christian thought that had occupied him, intellectually since his early 20s. The biblical lectures that he had posted on YouTube before anyone knew his name had always been, in some sense, confessional documents as much as academic ones. He has always been a man trying to believe something worth believing. The question is whether, after everything, he has found it. His children are grown. His daughter Michaela has her own platform, her own life, her own battles with serious illness. His son Julian is more private, less visible in the public narrative of his father's story. Tammy, recovered and steady, remains the fixed point around which everything else orbits. Peterson has said, in the way that men who are not naturally sentimental say these things, that he does not think he would have survived without her. Not the medical crisis, not the accumulation of attacks, controversies, and misrepresentations that have been the steady background noise of his public life for nearly a decade. Tammy is the Fairview he always carries with him, the cold, honest, undecorated North that tells him the truth when everything else is noised at T63. Jordan Peterson is still working. He publishes. He speaks. He debates. He engages with ideas and public figures and cultural arguments with an energy that should, given everything his body has been through, be impossible. He is not the same man who stood at that podium in the autumn of 2016 with a camera and a prepared statement and a willingness to lose everything rather than say something he believed to be false. He is older. He is scarred. He has been through enough that the scars are visible if you know how to look. But he is still undeniably present, still insisting on the same stubborn, unfashionable things. That responsibility matters more than rights. That the truth is more important than comfort. That the darkness is real, but that facing it honestly, which is the only way to face it, is what a human life is for. And now I want to speak directly to you, because this story is not just about Jordan Peterson. It never was. You have watched a man build an entire architecture of ideas out of his own pain. Out of Chris, who fell. Out of Fairview, where the winters didn't care about your feelings. Out of Tammy's illness and his own collapse, and a hospital room in Moscow that no one, looking at his public image, would have ever predicted he'd find himself inside. You have watched someone tell millions of people how to stand up straight and then have to learn in the most humbling and physical way possible what it actually means to try to stand up when you can barely walk. Here's the thing about that. Every person who has ever built something meaningful has done it while simultaneously hiding a version of the same story. The external success and the internal collapse often happen at the exact same time. The books and the addiction. The sold-out halls and the hospital room. The millions who found meaning in his words, and the man who had to rediscover what meaning felt like when he was too ill to form a coherent sentence. None of this cancels the other out. Both things are true at once. That is not a contradiction. That is what it looks like to be human. What Peterson's story asks of you, not in the abstract motivational poster sense, but in the raw, specific Fairview cold sense, is this: what are you refusing to see clearly in your own life right now? What are you medicating, distracting, avoiding? What did you promise yourself you would face when you had more time, more energy, more certainty that the facing would be worth it? The cold of northern Alberta never waited for Jordan Peterson to be ready. The real questions of your life are not waiting for you either. He still carries Fairview with him. The cold, flat horizon. The enormous, indifferent sky. The boy who paid attention. When you look at a 63-year-old man who has survived a coma, his wife's cancer, the cruelty of a million online voices, and the particular loneliness of being taken seriously by everyone and understood by almost no one. When you look at that man still showing up, still speaking, still insisting that the truth matters even when it costs you, the question you are left with is not about Jordan Peterson at all. The question is, when your own winter comes, and it will come, what will you have built that is worth the cold?